Getting your next franchise cornerstone in the NFL draft is always the goal, but it's never guaranteed. Whichever team goes through the misery of the worst season in the league to land the top pick is more than likely in need of a quarterback, but that's not always the case for whatever reason. Whether it's a subpar quarterback class or the team in question is banking on their current signal caller to be there for the future, every once in a while we get a draft class headlined by not only a non-quarterback, but a non-skill position player in general. With the weight of being the number one pick, how do these players' careers end up? Let's talk about some of them. My name is Caleb, and non-skill position number one overall picks are always so interesting to me. With QBs being the most commonly selected top picks, with running backs coming in second all time, non-skill positions that go first overall can really shake up the rest of the draft order and arguably don't have as many eyes watching their careers as closely, especially considering they're going to bad teams to start their careers. Since 2000, there have been only 7 non-skill position players taken first overall, and among those, you have your draft busts, overall solid players, and a future Hall of Famer.
First choice in the NFL Draft 2000, the Cleveland Browns select Courtney Brown, defensive end, Penn State.
The Cleveland Browns held the first draft pick of both the 2000s decade and the new millennium, and took the reigning Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year and unanimous All-American Courtney Brown to headline their defense. They were going into their second year after being reestablished as a franchise in 1999 and went 2-14, allowing the most yards and third most points during the season. Across most NFL mock drafts at the time, it was either Brown or his Penn State teammate LeVar Arrington who were considered a can't-miss first overall selection. The Browns made their choice and went with Courtney, who had recorded 33 sacks and 70 TFLs in his 4-year career at Penn State. The Nittany Lions consistently had one of the best defenses in the country, with Brown leading the way, so initially it seemed like Cleveland had made the right choice, especially after a promising rookie year with the Browns. As a first-year player, Courtney Brown was actually really solid, recording 69 total tackles and 4.5 sacks, including a 3-sack game against division rival Pittsburgh during Week 3. It was his breakout game, and he continued pretty consistent play for the rest of the season. But for the man whose last name matched the team that he played for, he was one of the many unfortunate players in this league to suffer injury after injury. Knee and ankle issues allowed for him to only play 5 games in his second year, and from 2001 to his last year in Cleveland in 2004, those knee injuries would linger. He'd only played a total of 47 games for the Browns across 5 years, and after a single season in Denver in 2005, he'd retire and call it a career. Though Courtney Brown has been given the bust label, injuries played a big part in that, and it being the Browns that took him obviously just adds to the many draft misses that Cleveland has had throughout the years. He stayed out of the spotlight after his NFL career, but he does occasionally attend Penn State games.
With the first selection in the 2006 NFL Draft, the Houston Texans select Mario Williams, defensive end, North Carolina State.
Coming off of what people consider the greatest national championship game of all time, the Texans holding the number one pick were in the perfect spot to either take Reggie Bush out of USC or Vince Young out of Texas. But the night before the draft, Houston management came out and said they were taking Mario Williams out of NC State, to everyone in the NFL world's surprise. A lot of mock drafts at the time had him going in the top 5 anyway, but there weren't many, if any at all, that had him going first. He had a great career at NC State, setting the career sack record, including a 14.5 sack senior season in 2005, but a lot of fans felt that they were passing on a generational talent in Reggie Bush. But looking back on this draft and both of their careers almost 2 decades later, the Texans actually made the right choice. Now, Mario Williams' career didn't necessarily live up to the billing of a number one pick, but he did have one of the best careers out of anyone drafted in the first round that year. He started all 16 games as a rookie with 47 tackles, 4.5 sacks, and a forced fumble. His second season is when the potential the Texans saw in him originally would leap out, as he'd record 14 sacks and be named a second-team All-Pro. He was living up to the number one pick billing almost immediately, being named to 2 straight Pro Bowls and All-Pro teams. But towards the end of his Texans tenure, the wear and tear of one of the best young pass rushers in the league would catch up to him. In 2010, he'd be diagnosed with an inflamed hernia, and in 2011, he'd play only 5 games due to a torn pectoral muscle. Despite the injury concerns, Williams was still very productive when on the field, and in the 2012 offseason, the Bills signed him to a 6-year deal worth $100 million with $50 guaranteed, which made him the highest paid defensive player ever at the time. In his first 3 years in Buffalo, all the injury concerns went out the window as he posted 3 years of 10.5, 13, and 14.5 sacks while playing all 16 games in each season. Williams was back in his all-pro form and had etched himself as one of the best defensive players in the league. But come 2015, the Bills would hire Rex Ryan as their head coach, and with his new defensive scheme, it would have Williams rushing less and dropping back into coverage way more. Some schemes you can plug any player into, but Williams was just not a good fit for the Ryan defense. His numbers would fall off a cliff, and he was released by Buffalo at the end of the 2015 season. He spent his final year in the NFL with the Dolphins in 2016, but only recorded a sack and a half. Williams at his peak was one of the best pass rushers in the NFL, and while he may not have been #1 pick material, he had a very solid and underrated NFL career that honestly clears him of any bust discussion.
With the first pick in the 2008 NFL Draft, the Miami Dolphins select Jake Long, Sr., Michigan.
The 2007 Dolphins won a very ugly 1-15, which landed them the first overall pick in the 08 draft. For a team that only won one game the year before and were clearly rebuilding, you'd think they'd maybe take the top quarterback prospect on the board to get the ball rolling. But in an interesting situation, they had already negotiated and agreed with a contract with Jake Long before ever choosing him. Legendary coach Bill Parcells was the Dolphins GM at the time, but with their eye already on Long, they wanted to avoid a contract holdout similar to what Jamarcus Russell had the year before with the Raiders. Before Long even heard his name called, he had agreed to a 5-year, $57 million contract, which made him, at the time, the highest paid O-lineman in NFL history before ever playing a snap. Coming out of Michigan, Jake Long was about as sure of a thing as you could get at his position. The two-time Big Ten Offensive Lineman of the Year, was almost unanimously the best player on the draft board according to most analysts and mock drafts at the time. And to start his career, he really lived up to the huge contract he signed before ever officially becoming a Dolphin. On an O-line that gave up 42 sacks the year before, he'd line up at left tackle and anchor one of the best offensive lines in the league on a team that would end up going 11-5 his rookie year. He was named to his first Pro Bowl after giving up 2.5 sacks and was very consistent throughout his time in Miami. From 2008 to 2011, he'd be a 4-time Pro Bowler and 2-time All-Pro selection, being named to the first team in 2010. But by 2012, he'd be another #1 overall pick, hampered by chronic injuries. He starts 61 games in a row before dealing with a back injury in the middle of the 2011 season, but as he'd make his way back to the field in 2012, his play would steadily decline. Long would move on from the Dolphins to sign with the Rams in 2013, and after seemingly getting healthy again, he'd tear his ACL with 2 games left in the season, just to tear it again in October of 2014. By all accounts, Long, when healthy, was a Hall of Fame talent, but was never fully healthy as he reached the prime of his career. In 2015, he'd play a total of 11 snaps with the Falcons across 4 games, and ended his career in Minnesota in 2016, playing 4 games as well for them. In hindsight, the Dolphins could have gotten a player like Matt Ryan in 2008, who was only 2 picks later to Atlanta, but Long, while healthy, was a good player and one of the better non-skill position #1 picks in recent memory.
With the first pick in the 2013 NFL Draft, the Kansas City Chiefs select Eric Fisher, tackle, Central Michigan.
The 2013 draft, by most accounts at the time, was easily one of the weaker drafts in terms of first-round talent, and in hindsight, that couldn't have been more true. It was one of those seasons where you weren't really excited to have the #1 pick, and in the Chiefs' case, they landed it by going 2-14 the season before. But if there was any position at the time that draft experts thought was the strongest, it was on the offensive line. So with that being the case, the Chiefs took Eric Fisher, offensive tackle out of Central Michigan. The first-team All-American was first on a lot of mock drafts, and at the time, and to Fisher's credit, he became the first player from the MAC to ever be selected first overall. And Fisher, while he was never particularly great during his time in Kansas City, would be integral to the franchise for almost a decade. After starting 13 games his rookie year at right tackle, Andy Reid made the decision to move him to left tackle, the position he'd stay at for the rest of his career. Fisher played 8 seasons in Kansas City, being named to the Pro Bowl in 2018 and 2020, and was part of the 2019 Super Bowl team that kicked off the Chiefs' dynasty. Eric Fisher had an overall solid career at tackle and protected Patrick Mahomes' blind side during his first MVP season. Not to mention, he was also able to catch a touchdown pass from Mahomes in 2020 during his last season in KC. He played 1 year for the Colts in 2021, but hasn't seen the field since that season, and he'd retire in 2022. For the number 1 overall pick in one of the weakest draft classes ever, he was able to become a key piece to start the most recent NFL dynasty and was overall a solid contributor.
With the first pick in the 2014 NFL Draft, the Houston Texans select Jadeveon Clowney, defensive end, South Carolina.
Has a single play in college football ever had a player jump to the top of draft boards more than Jadeveon Clowney's hit in the 2013 Outback Bowl? It'd be hard to argue against any other moment because after that play, he became a household name and the Texans would be the team to take him off the board as the first pick in 2014. Clowney was considered to be a generational defensive talent going back to when he was in high school in South Carolina as a 5-star recruit, and his time with the Gamecocks delivered and then some. As a true freshman, he won SEC Freshman of the Year and be named second team All-SEC, and as a sophomore, he was the SEC Defensive Player of the Year. But as the number 1 pick, the start of his career would be less to be desired. His rookie year only saw him play 4 games and 2 starts after tearing his meniscus and missing the rest of his season, and in his second year, he played 13 games and only recorded 4.5 sacks. Not the start you want from a player whose size, speed, and potential pass rushing ability was enough for you to use your first pick on them. But he'd eventually come into his own in 2016, playing all 16 games, helping lead the Texans to the playoffs, and named a second team All-Pro and Pro Bowler. While his numbers may not have jumped off the page for that season, his impact on the field was finally being made, and the Texans seemed to maybe have had a future figured out with him and JJ Watt anchoring the defense. His pass rushing ability was just okay, but he was a pretty solid run stopper during his time in Houston. He'd follow up his 2016 season with 2 more Pro Bowl appearances, and when it became time for a new deal after the 2018 season, Clowney wanted more money than Houston was willing to give. So they would franchise tag him and he was traded to Seattle prior to the 2019 season. Since his time in Houston, Clowney has become a bit of a journeyman throughout his career, spending time with the Seahawks, Titans, Browns, Ravens, and most recently the Panthers in 2024. For where he was taken, Clowney definitely underachieved as the top pick, but he did have some solid years later in Houston and even at times in Cleveland and Baltimore. Overall, not great, but a very good player at times.
With the first pick in the 2017 NFL Draft, the Cleveland Browns select Myles Garrett, defensive end, Texas A&M.
Myles Garrett, coming out of A&M, was another can't-miss defensive prospect going back to his days in high school as a 5-star recruit. As the Browns were coming off a dismal 1-15 season, they could use a game record like Garrett to finally turn the franchise around. 17 years earlier, their fortunes taking a defensive end first overall was not the greatest to say the least. But with Garrett as a unanimous All-American and recording 32.5 sacks during his 3-year college career, they were more than okay taking Garrett over a quarterback despite not having an established signal caller to build with. And maybe, at first, it seemed like the Browns should have just bit the bullet and taken a QB. In Garrett's rookie season in 2017, the Browns would have their infamous 0-16 season and etch themselves into the history books as one of the worst teams in league history. Garrett was easily the only bright spot on the team because even though he was limited to 11 games due to an ankle injury, he recorded 31 tackles, 7 sacks, and a fumble recovery. And starting in his second season in 2018, he'd established himself as not only one of the best defensive players in the league, but become one of the greatest non-skill position number 1 picks ever. From 2018 to 2024, he'd record double-digit sacks in every season, including back-to-back seasons of 16 and 21 in 2022. In 2023, he'd win the league's highest honor for a defensive player and bring home the 2023 Defensive Player of the Year award after leading the Browns to the playoffs for only the second time in 20 years. His resume is starting to look like one of a Hall of Famer and one of the greatest defensive players of all time, and though the Browns' team success overall has not been there since drafting Garrett, he's now the highest paid non-quarterback in NFL history after signing a 4-year, $160 million extension this offseason.
With the first pick in the 2022 NFL Draft, the Jacksonville Jaguars select Trayvon Walker, linebacker, Georgia.
And that brings us to the most recent non-skill position player to be drafted first overall, and the only one so far this decade in Trayvon Walker out of Georgia. Walker was one of the more interesting choices that Jacksonville could have made because he wasn't slated to go first overall by most analysts and mock drafts at the time until maybe the day before, as most mocks had Aiden Hutchinson out of Michigan going first. But the Jags liked Walker's upside and fit on their defense, so they take the former Georgia Bulldog, their second #1 overall choice in a row. Walker was a part of those stacked Georgia defenses of the early 2020s, including as a starter on the national championship team in 2021, a year where he'd recorded 37 tackles and 6 sacks as a junior. Walker's 3-year career hasn't been anything that jumps off the page so far, but he's shown steady improvement each season. After 49 tackles and 3.5 sacks his rookie year, he'd follow with 2 back-to-back 10-sack seasons while playing all 17 games. The Jags picked up his 5th-year option during this past offseason, and they are banking on his continued development and hope that he can eventually live up to that #1 pick billing. Obviously, the non-skill position #1 pick is a mixed bag of busts, solid players, and potential all-time greats, but that's really the nature of every top pick. Though some of these players may have been forgotten or put on the back burner for whatever reason, being in the exclusive club of #1 overall picks without being a quarterback or any other non-skill position is still relatively very impressive. My name is Caleb. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe. Appreciate y'all for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.